Hello and welcome to Coding from Scratch lecture part 2. We'll be covering JavaScript, the terminal, and source control. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So what is JavaScript? JavaScript is the programming language of the web. It is the only programming language understood by every modern web browser. JavaScript enables us to build the interactive website we use daily. So essentially, you can think of JavaScript as the muscle of a website. It's what's making a website interactive. It allows us to do cool stuff with the information that we get on a website. Allows us to again, be interactive with the user. So the first things first, when you are introducing JavaScript into a project, you want to be sure that you're connecting your JavaScript file to your HTML files. And the way that we do that is using a script tag. So the way that that looks is just like every HTML tag, we have an opening and closing tag. And then within that, the script tag has an attribute, which is the source, similar to the image source attribute, where you just put the source of the file. So if we look at an example here, I have an index.html file and I have a CSS file here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a JavaScript file. So I'm going to add a new file. I'm going to call it script.js, and you can call it whatever you like. Just make sure there's a .js. So I have my JavaScript file here, and now I'm going to connect it to my index.html file. And I'm going to do that by putting my script tag at the bottom of my body. So right before the closing body tag, we're going to put our script tag. So I'll have my opening and closing script tag here. And then I'm going to have my source attribute, and then have my quotations. And then inside of the quotations, I'm going to say, where does this JavaScript file exist? It's directly in my project root directory here. So I'm just going to write script.js. So now these two files are connected. We have the index.html file connected to the script.js file. So there we have the connection. In JavaScript, there are variables. So you can think of variables as containers. They hold a value so we can use it throughout our websites. When declaring a variable in JavaScript, we use the var keyword followed by the name of the variable. So if we look at the example here, we have var student name equals Ricardo. With Ricardo, there are different types of variables. So this is an example of a string. There's also numbers, booleans, and objects. Objects is something that we'll discuss later on into the program, so don't worry too much about that. But for now, we'll just worry about strings, numbers, and booleans. So if we are looking at example here, and I have var name equals Cassandra, let's give me a capital here, then this is a string type. Okay, if I have age, let's see here, and I say a number, this is number type. And then let's say I have another variable called is instructor, and that I'm going to set to equal to true, and this is of Boolean type. So you can see the different types here. We have string, which is encased by quotations. We have number, which is just a plain old number. And then we have Boolean, which is going to be either true or false. So this could be true or this could be false. Both are Boolean values. So those are the main data types that you'll be dealing with in JavaScript, string, number, and Boolean. With that, we're going to go ahead and jump into if statements. If statements are kind of where you're making your decisions. You're checking a certain condition, and if that condition is true, you want something specific to happen. If the condition is not true, then we want something else to happen. So that's where the if-else statement comes in. There's also the if-else statement, and that's essentially we're checking multiple conditions, and if both of those conditions run false, then we're going to do something else. So for an example, if we're looking here, we'll say if, and the main structure of an if statement is going to be if, with the keyword if with the parentheses, and then some curly brackets. Inside of the curly brackets is considered a code block, and inside of the parentheses is where we're going to write the condition that we are checking. So with this, I'm going to check if name is Cassandra, then I will console.log Cassandra is my professor. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. Now, if we just look at it and run it in our heads first, I'm checking to see if name is equal to Cassandra. If this runs true, then we're going to perform this. If it runs false, then this code is never executed. So in this case, name is equal to Cassandra, so we should see Cassandra is my professor. So if we go here and open it up, and let me refresh this. And if we right click and hit inspect, and then go to the console, we see Cassandra is my professor has been printed out. So that's exactly what we expect it to be. Now, if I change this to, let's say, Michael, and I save that, this should not be printed out at all. This is going to skip this code because does Michael equal Cassandra? No, it does not. And excuse me, I was supposed to put 3 equal signs there. So here, the 3 equal signs is doing comparison. What I was doing before is I was assigning a value. So that was my mistake. So when we're checking conditions, you want to make sure that you're using the 3 equal signs. That is comparison. This is an assignment. We're changing the value. So if we do that and run it here, we see that it just was not printed out. Okay, so let's say we wanted to add an else statement, right? We want something to print out if it's not true. Else, we will console.log Cassandra is not my professor. Okay. So since we have name equal to Michael, this is going to run false, so this isn't going to occur. But since we have an else statement, this will run. So if this is false, this will run. If this is true, this will run, and this will get skipped. So let's go ahead and check it out. And we see here, Cassandra is not my professor. Okay. Now, let's say we wanted to check multiple conditions, right? And we wanted to use an else if statement. So here, we'll include if, else if, and then we'll have something here. So let's see, I am checking to see, okay, so we'll do else if name is equal to Michael, then we can write Michael is my professor. And then our else statement can say, I do not have a professor. Okay, so let's say we're checking multiple conditions here, right? We're checking if name is Cassandra, then we'll print out Cassandra as my professor. Else if name is equal to Michael, then Michael is my professor. Else, if these are both false, we'll run I do not have a professor. So let's start off with name equaling Cassandra. We'll save it. And we get what we expect. Cassandra is my professor. Now, if we change it to Michael up here, we should expect that this line of code will run. Michael is my professor. That line of code ran. Now, let's say we change this name to Lucy. We should expect that this line of code will run because this will return false and this will return false. I do not have a professor. So that's how you can use if, else statements. You're checking conditions to make a decision, right? If it's raining outside, then I'm going to grab an umbrella. If it's sunny outside, then I'm going to go to the pool. And then you can combine that into one statement. If it's raining outside, then I'm going to grab an umbrella. Else, if it's sunny, I'm going to go to the pool. Else, let's say it's not sunny or if it's not raining, else I'm going to stay inside and read a book. So those are examples of real life examples of when you would use that, and then you can translate that into code, right? So when you run into a problem where you have to check conditions and make decisions based off those conditions, that's when this comes into play. Are there any questions on if, or else statements at the moment? This is something you want to feel comfortable with and familiar with because you will be using it quite a bit. I'm going to take the silence as no questions. So we'll go ahead and make sure here. We'll go ahead and move on then. So we'll jump into arrays. An array is a data structure that we use to store values. You can think of them as a collection of values or as a list. You can use an array to store multiple values. One thing with an array is in JavaScript, if you create an array, they all have to be of the same data type. And that's where we're talking about numbers, Booleans, strings. So if we look at the example here below, we have a fruit array, and it's full of strings, right? We have apples, oranges, peaches, bananas, grapes. And this is a list. So you can think of it like a grocery item list. So if we're looking here, let me label this here in case you want this code for later. All right, so let's say I create an array. We're using the var keyword groceries, and I'm going to set it equal. And with arrays, you want it to be inside of square brackets. That's telling the compiler that this is an array. So in here, I'm going to have groceries. So I'm going to say coffee, milk, eggs, bacon, bread. Okay, so I have an array full of items inside of my variable groceries. Now with arrays, there is something called an index. An index is essentially telling you where you are in the array. So with an index, it starts off at base 0, meaning that the first element is index 0. So this is index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, index 4. Now the total number of elements in this array is 5. Okay, so if we say console.log groceries at index 2. Okay, and how we write that is the name of the array with square brackets and then the number or variable representing the index pointing to where we want it to be. So if we are going to print out console log groceries at index 2, we can expect that eggs will be printed out because remember, this is 0, this is 1, this is 2. So if we go ahead and let me go ahead and comment those out. So if we come back here, oops, wrong way, and we refresh, we have eggs printed out. Okay. Now, if I wanted to figure out the total length of an array, let's say you get in an array and you need to figure out the total length. There is a method that exists for arrays, which is called .length. So let's say we have a variable called total elements, and I'm going to set it equal to groceries.length. Okay. This is going to return the total number of elements in the array. So if we're looking at the array, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this should return the number 5, and then total elements should then equal 5. So if I console.log total elements, we should expect the number 5. So I'm going to comment this out. And there we see the number 5. Okay. Also, with arrays, there are a couple other methods that you'll use called push and pop. So push is going to add an element to your array at the very end, and pop is going to take the last element of your array. So let's say that we wanted to add something to our list, right? I forgot to add, let's say, bananas. So I'm going to do groceries.push bananas. Okay? And that is going to add bananas to the end of our list. So if I console.log groceries, and I'll comment these out. We save that here. We should expect to see coffee, milk, eggs, bacon, bread, bananas. So let's go ahead and check it out. And that's exactly what we get. Coffee, milk, eggs, bacon, bread, bananas. Now, .pop is going to remove the last item. So if we do .pop and then we console log groceries, we should expect bananas to no longer be there, and we'll end up with our original list. Okay? And the reason for that is because we added bananas and now we're taking away bananas. Now notice I didn't put anything inside of the parentheses for pop. That's because pop is going to remove the last item on the list. So you can't specify, I want to remove milk. Pop is just going to remove the last item. So if we click save, oops, wrong way, we see that bananas was taken away. Okay. Any questions on basic methods with arrays in general, how to create them? Oh, here we go.
Can you see the chat?
Oh yeah, I see it. I didn't see it before, but with the 2 equal signs, so you can use 2 equal signs and you can use 3 equal signs. And if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself, but if you can't use your microphone, I'll keep this open. But essentially, 2 equal signs is going to check the values. 3 equal signs is going to check the value and data type. So for example, if you have the number 5, and then you have the string 5. So let's say you had 5, 5. It's just going to check the value. So both of these values are 5, so this will return true. However, if we did 3 equal signs, we're checking for not only value, but data type. So this is number data type, and this is a string data type. So this is going to return false. And it's good to use 3 equal signs and get used to using 3 equal signs, because most commonly you're going to need it to be the same data type. If for whatever reason, whatever you're checking, and you just need to check the value, you don't need it to be the same data type, then you would do 2 equal signs. All right, and you feel okay about arrays? All right, so we'll keep on going then and jump into loops. So loops enable us to repeat a series of commands until a certain condition is met. There are a bunch of different types of loops out there in JavaScript, but I'm going to primarily focus on the for loop, because any other loop that exists, you can write with a for loop. So for loop, the construction of that is the for keyword, and then parentheses, and then your curly brackets, just like if statements. But instead of just one thing inside of your parentheses, loops have 3 segments. So, and they're separated by semicolons. The first is declaring a variable that's going to represent your index. So most commonly you'll see I. It doesn't have to be I. You can call it whatever you want, but you just see I because that's short for index. So we're declaring a variable I, and we're setting it equal to 0 because that's where we want our index to start. And then the second part is going to be similar to like an if statement where we're writing a condition. So we have I less than stopping point. Now, keep in mind that it's not always going to be I less than something. It's not going to always be I equals 0, but this is always a good place to start. So depending on the problem that you're working on, these things might change. Same for this one. But for the purpose of this, we are just going to do I less than some stopping point. So let's say that we wanted to print out all the items on the grocery list. Then I want my stopping point to be the end of the list. Okay, so as long as the index is less than the total number of elements, then we're good to go, and we'll execute this code. As soon as I is no longer less than my stopping point, then I'm going to exit and not execute this code and just move on to the next line of code. The third part is incrementing I. So whenever you see plus, plus, or minus, minus, it means you're either adding 1 or minusing 1. So we start off with 0, we execute some code, and then this happens. And then now I equals 1. So we execute that code, and let's say we're saying I less than 2, right? So now it's equal to 1. We execute the code. Now we added 1 to I, so I is equal to 2. Is 2 less than 2? No, it's not. So then we exit the loop, and this code is not executed for a third time. So let's go ahead and play with some loops here. Let me uncomment this. So with loops, we are going to create a for loop, and I'm going to declare my index started at 0, and then I'm going to say I less than groceries.length. Okay, groceries.length is going to give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're dealing with indexes. So remember, there's no 5th index. The last index is 4 because we start off at 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we know as soon as the index hits the number 5, we can exit the loop because there is no 5th index. So that's why you want to do groceries.length. but we declared a variable up here that is groceries.length. So I'm going to use that variable and say I less than total elements. And then we'll do I plus plus. And then I'll have my code block here. And then let's say I want to just console.log groceries at I. Okay. So essentially, I just want to print out every item on the list here. And I represents where I am on my index. So we start off with 0. So that's going to be coffee. Then we add 1. So then we'll have milk printout, and so on and so forth until we get, let's pretend we're here. So I is equal to 4 right now. So groceries at 4. It's going to print out bread. Then we're going to add 1 to I. So now I equals 5. And then is 5 less than 5? No, it's not. So we'll exit here and it'll move on to the next line of code that you have written here. So let's go ahead and see this in action. And there we have it. It prints it out for us here, just as we had expected. Okay, so when you are going to your final project, you are going to be using a loop and some if statements. So keep all of this in mind as we're going through it. Any questions on for loops? All right, so let's keep it moving then. So with that, that takes me on to functions. Functions allow us to reuse a block of code without having to rewrite it multiple times. So let's say there's something that you need to do over and over and over again. And why write out all that code every single time you need to use it? Instead, just put it all in a function, make it something very general so that you can just reuse it whenever you need to. So let's say, let's look at the structure. So we have function, the keyword function. So this is similar to var when you are declaring a variable. Instead, we're declaring a function. So function, then you have your name of function, and then you have parentheses. Inside of those parentheses is going to be your parameters. Parameters are essentially what you need in order to get the function to work. So some functions don't have any parameters at all. You don't need any information given in order to get the function to work. Other functions require some information. So depending on the type of function that you're writing and what you need it to do, you'll either have no parameters, in which you'll have the parentheses, but it'll be blank inside. Or maybe you have one parameter and you have the name of that parameter. If you have multiple parameters, you just are going to separate them by commas. Then after the parentheses, you'll have your curly brackets and have the code that you want to execute. So if we look at an example here, let me comment all this out here. And if we're looking at functions, let's say I have a function called add numbers, and I'm going to add 3 numbers. So in order for me to add 3 numbers, I know that I need 3 parameters. I need 3 numbers in order to add them. I'm going to call them X, Y, and Z. You can call them whatever you like. And then inside of my code block, I'm going to perform my function. So let's say I have a variable called sum, and it's going to equal X plus Y plus Z, and then I'm going to console.log sum. Okay, so there I have created my function. If I were to run this right now, nothing would happen. So if we look here, nothing's happening. That's because I didn't call on this function. I didn't invoke this function. I didn't use this function. I just created a definition for it. So in order to use the function, you have to write the name of the function. And then if it requires parameters, well, if it doesn't, either way, you'll have your parentheses. So let's say this function didn't require any parameters. I would just leave it like this, and then it would run. If I run it like this, you'll see here, we don't get anything. And that's because we didn't insert the parameters that we need. So I am going to insert, let's say, 1, 2, 3. So this should return the number 6, right? We should see 6 printed out. And the way that you write it is respective to the definition. So x is equal to 1, y is equal to 2, z is equal to 3. Okay, so if we run that, we should expect the number 6, and that's exactly what we get. Now, an example of a function that doesn't require parameters, let's say you just need it to print something out. Let's call it say hello. Going to write hello. And then I'm just going to call on this function as so. Comment these guys out so we don't have to see those results. We'll save it, and if we go back here, we see that it says hello. Okay. Now with functions, they can be super simple like this, or they can be very complicated depending on what you need it to do. So let's say that we had a text box here. So this is going to be similar to the project that your end of JavaScript project. Actually, before I jump into that, let me talk about something else. So we'll come back to this. But any questions on functions? All right. So let's jump into scope. Scope is the area in which your variables and functions can be accessed. There are 3 types of scope. You have global, function, and block. Global is declared outside of a block or function, and you can access it from anywhere. So if we're looking at our code here, let's say I uncomment everything. Okay, let's say I uncomment everything, and we have these variables up here that I declared, right? These are outside of a function. These are outside of a block. These are considered global variables. They have the scope of global, which means that I can use it in here. So let's say I wanted to put name here, and let me comment all this out so it doesn't print out all the things we don't want. So if we do that, we should see that Lucy gets printed out. See that Lucy is printed out. So you notice that Lucy is not defined in the function. It's nowhere near here. It's global. It's of global scope. So we can access it anywhere in any function in any code block. Okay. Then we have function scope, which is declared within a function. It's accessed only from inside of the function. So what that means is, let's look at this variable sum. This sum is declared inside of a function declaration, which means sum can only be used inside of this function. So if I try to console.log sum here, I'm going to get an error, because sum is not defined out here. So let's comment all this out here. So we're only looking at this. And let's see what we get. Uncaught reference error. Sum is not defined. And that's correct. Sum is not defined in this scope. It is defined in this scope, but not here. So this is considered function scope. Okay. All right. Now, if we are talking about block scope, and that's something that's fairly new. It was introduced in ES5, and that's when we're using the let keyword. This is when you're going to use like a temporary variable, not something that you need to keep. You just you need something to hold information for a temporary amount of time, and you only need it in a certain section of your code. So that is considered a block scope, and it's essentially anything that lives inside of set of curly brackets. So if we are looking at, let's say, an if statement here. Let me write a new if statement. If true, then I'm going to let name equal, let's say, Anna. And then I'm just going to console.log name here. And let me comment all this out. Okay, so this is only in the use of this code block. So if I run this, it's going to run just fine. But let's say, comment this out here, and I want to console.log name. We're going to get an error because let is only available inside of this code block between these curly brackets. So if we refresh, what is it saying, Lucy? For some reason, it's still reading this. Guess my commenting of out is not working here. Let's just erase this. Oh, it's reading previously. So let me access here. Let's do a refresh. Going to inspect. I'm not sure why it's still reading Lucy. I think it might be just leaving old responses here. But if we did, let me just copy the code here. Let's see. Take this out. We try to run this. It's still reading Lucy from somewhere. I'm not too exactly sure why. That's something I'll have to look at later. But you know it's not printing out Anna, okay? Because Anna is only available in here. So if we were to leave it in here just like this, we see that Anna is printed out. And Lucy's printed out again because it's still reading this global variable of Lucy. Not too sure why, because I got rid of it. But if that global variable did not exist, this would not work. Okay, so let's go ahead and put everything back to where it was. And I can fix this later. All right, so that is scope. Any questions on scope? Are there any naming conventions for global versus function versus block? Not in JavaScript so much. In other languages like C#, there are definitely naming conventions for global and local scope. But you essentially want to steer away from global variables because they're going to cause problems, especially when you have a bunch of code. So if you can avoid the global variables, you kind of want to stick to function and block. All right, so let's go ahead and keep moving here. So now we're going to discuss DOM elements. The DOM is the document object model. It's essentially a programming interface for HTML document. It provides a visual representation of the HTML elements you placed in your document. So if we look at this previously written code I wrote, I have a little bit of HTML written out, and we can see it here. Right? So this whole thing is considered the DOM, okay? And we're going to be interacting with the DOM in order to make some JavaScript magic happen. So with that, you're going to use different methods that exist for the DOM. So one of the main ones, and there are quite a different other ones, and they're more described in the curriculum. I'm just going to focus on get element by ID, but there are things like get elements by class, get elements by tag name, things like that. So just be aware that those exist. You might need to use them in your code, but this is just an example of one, so you can kind of get a feel for it. So if we're looking at document.getElementById, the structure of that is document.getElementById, and it's in camel case. Camel case meaning the first word is going to be lowercase, and then the beginning of every word after that is going to have a capital letter. So we see the E, B, and I are capitalized. Then you'll have your parentheses. Inside of your parentheses inside of quotes is going to be your ID name. Now with this, you'll have different things that you can add to it. .value, .innerHTML, .add event listener. So let's go ahead and play with it for a second here. So if we have, let's say we have a text area here, okay? And in my code, that's this box. Let's say I wanted the user to write some text in there, and I just wanted to print out the text back to them. So I'm going to write an ID for this text area, and you're going to want to do that inside of your opening tag. So it's just going to be like an attribute, just like you do for CSS, just like you do in HTML. And I'm going to call it user input. Okay. So then let me comment all this out. Sure, there's nothing need there. So here I'm going to have a variable called user text, and I'm going to set it equal to document.getElementById, and then my ID is going to be, what did I call it here? User input. So user input. And then I will do, so if I leave it just like this, user text is going to equal the entire element. So including the opening and closing tags. We don't want that in this case. We want what's inside of the text area. So I'm going to do .value, and that's going to return whatever the user put inside of the text. So if we do .value, and I'm going to console.log. Well, actually, let's do this in the console here. So let's inspect here. We're going to work in our console. And this is great for debugging. So let's say we have var user text equals document.getElementById. ID name is user input. And I'm just going to leave it like that. So if I do user text, oh, hold on. Oh wait, I didn't refresh this. Okay, so var user text equals that. And then if we return user text, we see that is equal to the entire text area. Now, if I wanted the value, whatever's inside, so I am writing something, okay, we have something in the text area. So now if I do user text dot value, it's going to return what is inside of the text area. Okay, so if we wanted to print something out to the DOM, right? Let's say I wanted to write what was in here and I wanted to print it out right here onto the page. That's where we're going to use .inner HTML. So before we do that, we need to create a space to write that. So let's say right below our button, I'm going to have an H3 tag, and it's going to have the ID of result. Okay, so now when I refresh this here, I want, let's say, I'm going to use variables so it doesn't get lengthy here. Let's say var user text is going to equal dot value. So user text is equal to this sentence, and just to make sure, okay, we have that. So now I want to write to the DOM. So I'm going to do document.getElementById. The ID that I want to use in this case is result. And you can see here that it's predicting what I want. So .inner HTML, and I'm going to set it equal to user text. And we see that it's printed out here. So what inner HTML is doing, if we look at the HTML, imagine that there is a cursor between your opening and closing tag. So whatever you set that equal to is as if you wrote it here. So the text I wrote was, I am writing something. So once that JavaScript is written, executes, it's as if it's doing this for you. Okay? So that's where you're going to use .inner HTML. Now, for add an event listener, that's going to be something like for a button. I'm not going to go over that in much detail because you can use the onClick attribute. So if you want to learn about add event listener, just message me and we can go over that. It dives a little bit deeper into JavaScript because other factors are involved. But we can definitely review that. But for the purpose of this lecture, we're just going to keep it basic. So with that, we have basic DOM manipulation here. Okay, we're grabbing information and we're putting information back. Are there any questions about the DOM or how to grab values or put inner HTML in there? All right, cool. So let's go ahead and keep moving. So Chrome Inspector, this is what we've been using this whole class period. So the Chrome Inspector is what I've been using. All you have to do is right-click, hit Inspect. You write to the console. Now, console is going to be just for you debugging. For debugging purposes, it's not going to actually change your code. But this is a great tool. So if you have any errors or your code's not working properly, you want to check your console because there will be usually a big red box with your error message. So let's go ahead and play with the onClick so we have it to where when I click this, it does the inner HTML writing for me. So let's go ahead and write this in our code. Okay, so here. So for onClick, if you remember last week, we set that equal to the name of the JavaScript function we want to run. So I'm going to call it print results. okay? So that means in my JavaScript, I'm going to need a function called print results. So function print results, and it doesn't require any parameters. I'm going to set var user text equal to, let me just copy and paste this here so I don't have to write it all over again. Okay. And then I'm going to print that out just like we did in the console. I'm just putting it in my file now. It's called results. Result. Inner HTML. And if you notice, I checked to see if it was results or result because it needs to match exactly. Otherwise, you're going to get an error. So we set that equal to user text. Okay. So let me comment this out here. Save that. So now when I click that button, it should do exactly what I want it to do. So let's refresh here. I am testing this out. Okay. So that is how we can incorporate that. Now let's say I wanted to count the total number of T's in this sentence. That's where we're going to incorporate everything that we just learned. We're going to incorporate a for loop. We're going to incorporate an if statement. We're going to incorporate the DOM. So let's keep this function the same here. And instead of printing out what we wrote, I'm going to print out the total number of T's. So I'm going to have another variable called total T. I'm going to set it equal to 0 because I haven't started counting anything yet. So I'm going to loop through the user text. So I'm going to declare my index, just as we did before. I'm going to make sure I is less than user text dot length. Okay. And then, so dot length you can use on arrays and strings. So this is a string, so we can use it just like we did with arrays. And strings have the same kind of indexing as arrays, so they start off at 0. And then I'll do I plus plus, because I'm going to increment through that. And then I'm going to check if user text at index I, depending on what index number I am through the loop, is equal to T. Okay. And then I'm going to add 1 to total T if that is true, right? So if it is equal to T, then total T is going to be updated, and that will go through the loop and loop through everything. So once that's done, we can print out our results. So document.getElementById result dot inner HTML is going to equal total T's equal plus total T. And what I'm doing here is string concatenation. I can't say that word right, but essentially when you're adding a string and a variable, or you're adding 2 strings, it will make one pretty string. So if we set that and we refresh here, I am counting total number of T's. Okay, so if we count this, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I should expect 4. Total T's equal 4. Okay, are there any questions on what I just did? This is going to be very similar to your final project. It is case sensitive. So if you're counting T's, so what you want to do is, if you're going to compare it to a lowercase t, you want to make it 2, I think it's for JavaScript 2 lowercase. Let me just double check. Yep. So here, since I'm comparing it to a lowercase t, I want to make sure that I make this letter lowercase. So what I'll do is I'll do dot to lowercase. Okay. So that so if I had like a capital T, total T's, TTT. Okay. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. 6. We get 6. Okay. Now, if I didn't have that, okay, and I'm using the same sentence, let's refresh. I get 4 because not counting these 2 capital T's. So that is a very good question and definitely something you want to keep mindful of. So when you're checking something that can be lowercase or uppercase, you want to make sure that when you're checking it, you're converting it to what you want it to be. So if I was checking it with a capital T, then I want to convert this to uppercase, like that. Okay. There are any other questions? Could you use an and in the if statement? Yes. So in the if statement, you can definitely use the 2 ampersands or the 2 pipes. So the 2 ampersands is going to equal and. So that means that you need 2 conditions to be true. You need both conditions to be true in order for it to return true. 2 pipes is going to be an or. So you only need one of them to be true. So let's say we're counting total number of T's and O's. So we're saying if, let's say we change this to total letters counted, okay, and say total letters counted, and then I'm checking for T's, or I'm checking for an O, okay. Okay. And O's, this is going to be total letters counted. Okay, so here I'm checking to see if it's a T or an O, because that's all I'm checking for. Okay, so if we go back here, we refresh, I am counting T's and O's. So let's see how much we should expect. 1, 2, 3, 4. We get 4. Any other questions? You could use if user text T or capital T, but that's a little bit excessive because the same value, I mean, unless you're specifically counting capital letters, then you want to do it like that. But otherwise, you want to just convert it to what you're checking, because then that's just extra code. And then that's, yeah, it's going to be best to convert, because otherwise you just have a bunch of extra code and it's unnecessary. And then it'll just load time will be forever, especially when you start adding things up. So it's just best to convert it from the get-go. All right. Any other questions before we move on to the next subject? All right. So let's keep it going. So next we're going to discuss the terminal. The terminal is an interface in which you can type and execute text-based commands. It's normally the terminal, you're used to a GUI, so that's what you're seeing right now on my computer. I right-click here and I want to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it folder 1, and then I'm in here, and then I want to, let's say, create a file. I use the command line. I don't even know how to use this thing anymore. So there's things that you create here in the GUI. With the terminal, you can use it with the computer, and you don't have to use a mouse. It's just a lovely keyboard. So there are basic commands here. We have Mac and Linux. These are going to be the commands, and these are going to be the Windows commands. I'm working on a Mac, so you're going to be seeing Mac commands in my example, but there are slightly different for Windows if you are using Windows. So we have ls, which stands for list the files in a current directory, and it's dir in Windows. Cd changes the directory that you're in. mv or move moves the file to a new location. cp or copy is going to copy a file. rm or del is going to delete a file. So if we are looking at a file organization here, we usually have our root file, or root directory or folder. And then in there you might have some subdirectories, some folders inside of folders. And inside of those folders or directories, you might have some files, you might have some other folders, things like this. So if we are looking here at the terminal, and I'm just going to pull it up right here. So this is my terminal, and I'm not exactly sure how to get to it on Windows, but for Mac, you would go to Utilities, and then you'll see Terminal. You'll open that up, and that will take you here. So if I do ls, it's going to list all the items in the current directory that I am in. So I want to jump to my desktop, so I'm going to change directory to desktop. Okay, now if I'm in here, I'm going to make a directory, so mkdir for Mac, and I'm going to call it folder 2. Okay, then I'm going to jump inside of this folder 2. So I'm going to change directory, and now I'm going to create some files. So I'm going to touch, that means create a file for Macs. I'm going to touch index.html, touch style.css, touch script.js. Okay, so if we come here and we look at my folder 2 here, we see those files have been created, right? And I did it in seconds here. There are resources I can give you if you message me later that will give you cheat sheets and a great resource on mastering the command line. There's a lot of things that you can do on the command line that you can't do on the interface. It's my favorite. It makes me feel like I'm in the 90s hacker movie. When I first learned it, I was very excited. So those are basic commands. So if I did remove style.css, it's going to remove that file here, and we see that it's gone. Okay, so it removes a lot of extra steps. Any questions about the terminal? These are very basic commands. There are a bunch of other commands that come with the terminal. You can message me on Slack. So my Slack username is cassandra.matos. So you can just send me a message, and then I can send you extra resources. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our last subject of the day, source control. So source control is a tool that allows developers to manage file changes through the development process. It allows each developer to write and test code on their own computer without interfering with another developer's workflow. It allows developers to work simultaneously with teammates. It allows them to go back in time and trace the source of bugs. And it allows us to easily version our code. So let's say you have a team of 5, and you guys are working on a project, and there's all these cool features that you want to put in your project, right? So Bob is working on this one, Lucy's working on this one, Mary's working on this one. So there is a master file, right? There's a master code, right? And we all pull from that, right? So Lucy has her version, Mary has her version, Bob has his version, and so on and so forth. So they are going to work on their own version of the code, right? So Lucy's doing her feature, Bob's doing his feature, Mary's doing her feature. And they are not changing the original source. Because let's say Lucy's working on something and what she's working on completely messes everything up, right? So instead of Lucy messing up the original code, she's working on her own version of it. And once that is done and developed and tested, then you can integrate it to the main source. So Lucy's feature has been made, tested, and it works perfectly. Now we can integrate it into the main source. Same for Bob, same for Mary. So that way they can work on their features simultaneously without destroying the actual production product. Okay. Also, let's say that Bob wrote some code, everything was working fine and dandy. Then he wrote some more code, and then he wrote some more code, and he's saving his progress as it goes on, and then all of a sudden there's a bug. So it's easy to trace back where that bug came from, because we know at this save point it was all good, at this save point it was all good, and until we got to this save point everything went awry. So what changes did we make from point C to point D? And then it'll be a lot easier for you to debug and see what's going on. So what you'll be using for source control is GitKraken. So what you want to do is you want to go to GitKraken.com and you're going to download it. It should automatically detect what kind of operating system you have. So it detected I had Mac, but there is Windows and Linux depending on what platform you're working on. It's completely free. So when you have that downloaded and you open it, it will look something like this. So this integrates with GitHub. So if we go to, in order to use GitKraken, you need to have a GitHub account. So we'll go to GitHub. And it's automatically signed into mine. So if you don't have GitHub, go ahead and sign up for it. And then I'm going to create a new repository. So I'm going to click this plus button, do new repository, and I'm going to say CFS lecture 2. Okay. Description, I'm going to do example of GitKraken. I'm going to leave it public, and then I'm going to initialize it with a README file. So I'm going to create this repository. Okay, so now I can open this repository with GitKraken. So I'm going to click on that little folder. I'm going to click on clone, and then I'm going to do github.com, and it's CFS lecture 2. This is the repository I want to clone. And where do I want to clone it to? I'm going to clone it to my desktop here, and then I'm going to just click clone the repo. Okay, so now that's been cloned, and I'm going to open it. We see here we're on a master branch here. Okay, so now with GitKraken, let's say I am opening CFS lecture 2, right? So we have our README file, and I'm going to open it with Adam here. Let me make this big here. So we have it on Adam. I'm going to exit these welcome screens, and I am going to create a new file, right? I'm going to call it index.html. I'm going to write some code, right? I have it saved. So I've made some changes, right? So here, when we go back to GitKraken, we'll see one file change in working directory. So we'll view the change, and then we're going to stage the changes, right? So I'm going to stage all changes. This is the file I'm going to stage. And then I'm just going to write what I did in the summary. So added index file, right? And then I'll commit the changes to one file. So you want to be committing and staging constantly. So every time, and not for like every single line of code that you write, but maybe for like a feature or a major change or something like that. So I'm going to commit the changes, okay? And those have been committed, but they haven't been pushed. And by that I mean, if we go back to GitHub and we refresh this, we see the index.html file is not there yet. We're just saving it. It's like keeping notes, like a notebook of what you did or a diary of the changes that you made. So let's say we've done all the things that we wanted to do and it's been tested and it's been featured and it's all good. So now I'm going to push. And it pushed to master. So now if we go back to GitHub, we see that index.html file is in there, and then our commit is noted here, added index file. So this is good for when you're making changes and you're adding notes. Let's say you're looking at a file, you're looking at your project and you're like, okay, what happened here? Okay, this obviously was affected by this commit, so let's see what happened here. Also with this, so remember when I was talking about Bob, Lucy, and Mary and all doing their own features, but they are not going to affect the master. So what you want to do is you're going to right click and then you're going to create a branch, okay? And let's say we call it Bob. So now Bob has his own branch where he can make the changes and he can commit those changes, but they're not going to affect master. Not until he's ready to merge with master will it be affected. And that's something that's written in great detail in your curriculum and something you're not going to be branching anything until you get into the group project phase. So just so you know that that's there. I highly recommend to make repos of all the projects that you make, because when it comes to applying for jobs and employers looking at your stuff time, they're going to go and look at your GitHub and see how active you are. They can go ahead and look here and click and see how you're coding. So let's say I wanted to look at this and I wanted to look at this file. I can see that file directly. Yeah, so that is GitHub. This creating a repo is essentially what I just showed you. Branching off. It also helps keep track of changes being made without impacting the main branch, which is what I was talking about with the different people working on their features. And that kind of wraps it up. Are there any questions on anything that I discussed? JavaScript, functions, variables, if statements, terminal. We kind of went over a lot today. All right. If you have any questions and you can't think of them now, you can Slack me at cassandra.matos, or you can email me cassandra.matos-mendez@codercamps. I am much quicker to responses on Slack, so I recommend that's the way that you go. If you don't know what Slack is, got a problem, so go ahead and email me so we make sure that we get you on there. But I'm going to open up to any questions. But if there are none, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And I appreciate you attending lecture today. Yeah, no problem. You guys enjoy the rest of your day, and please feel free to message me if you do have questions. And also do not forget to schedule your weekly code reviews with your mentor. Thank you and have a great day.